Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle podcast. I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And I'm Daniel Watkins.
And on today's episode, we're continuing our look into Alnwick Castle's American connections.
In the last episode of the podcast, you'll have heard our archivist talking about our new exhibition, which tells the story of Earl Percy, later the second Duke of Northumberland, in the American Revolutionary War. But his is not the only story that links the castle to what's now the United States.
On this podcast, you will hear the stories of an early English settler in Virginia, a fortune that led to the creation of an American institution, a First World War diplomat, and 3 20th century American icons. We hope you enjoy.
George Percy, adventurer. Born in 1580, George Percy was the youngest brother of the wizard Earl of Northumberland. In June 1606, King James VI and I granted a charter to the Virginia Company to establish an English settlement in North America. By the end of that year, just over 100 settlers set sail from London. George Percy was one of them, sailing on the Godspeed, making him the first Percy to travel to America.
Their instructions were to build a secure settlement, find gold, and seek a water route to the Pacific. The settlers landed on the 14th of May 1607 to establish an English colony 60 miles away from the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. The site of the colony had to be somewhere secure, where settlers would be as protected as possible from Spanish attacks.
Their first weeks were spent working on the first part of their instructions, as they created palisades, a defensive enclosure, for a wooden fort. This fort was where England's first permanent colony in North America began. The settlement was named Jamestown after the king.
George Percy kept a journal during his time in America. One entry described his early impressions of America and the advantages of their landing place.
Thereon we set our grapnel a halt, since after deciding afore on which place to stay on, hereunto 'tis. A place far of prying Spanish barks or spies, and a place with the goodliest cedar and sassafras, and also in of with strawberries 4 times bigger and better than ours in England. What a greatliest and most God-blessed day this be.
He also met and married his wife, Anne Floyd, in Jamestown. His elder brother, despite being imprisoned in the Tower of London, was able to organise for necessities and some luxuries to be sent out to Virginia for George.
Unfortunately, as historian Rachel Winchcombe has pointed out, the colonists did not have the agricultural or hunting skills to sustain themselves. After John Smith, the head of Jamestown, left the colony to return to England in 1609, George was made president of the colony. His time in charge was marked by a winter known as the Starving Time.
As many as 2/3 or even 3/4 of the colonists died during this winter, due to a combination of food shortages, divided leadership, and a siege of the fort by the indigenous Powhatan people. While John Smith had been fairly successful in trading goods for food in the early years of the settlement, Jamestown had always struggled to keep up a food supply, and they'd become more and more reliant on the Powhatan. Smith's forceful approach angered tribal communities who were also struggling for food due to a severe drought in the region. Tensions were growing as the settlers encroached on Powhatan land.
The Virginia Company sent a fleet of ships with more supplies and new colonists, but they were damaged by a hurricane and not all the ships arrived. The situation George Percy faced after Smith's departure had become desperate. Food supplies were low, and indigenous Chief Powhatan had ordered his warriors to attack any colonists or livestock found outside the fort. Around 300 settlers were now effectively besieged. By spring 1610, only 60 had survived.
Percy later wrote that the indigenous people killed as fast without the fort as famine and pestilence did within, and that any people who ventured into the local woods to look for food were cut off and slain.
Starvation led to diseases like dysentery and typhoid. Rachel Winchcombe states that once they'd finished the undesirable meats like horse and dog, they ate vermin like rats and mice. Once these were also gone, they tried inedible items like the leather from boots. Finally, as Percy wrote in an unpublished manuscript, famine was beginning to look ghastly and pale in every face, that nothing was spared to maintain life, and do to those things which seem incredible, as to dig up dead corpses out of graves and to eat them.
Percy's replacement as governor, Thomas Gates, arrived in Virginia in 1610 and quickly wrote an account that claimed that food was not as scarce as had been reported back in England. However, Gates's account had a clear intention of showing the colony was still viable, so might not be completely trustworthy. A later account, officially anonymous but believed to be by John Smith, claimed the colony declined after Smith left and that only the ordinary settlers starved. The commanders and officers like Percy did not. Percy, meanwhile, blamed the Powhatan people and their siege, which stopped any colonists from hunting or searching for food. He disputed the suggestion that the higher status settlers were spared, saying, "All of us at Jamestown felt the sharp prick of hunger."
Archaeological excavations in the 21st century have proven the extent of the starving time. Remains found by archaeologists include bones from dogs, rats and horses that show evidence of being butchered and cooked. In 2012, another excavation revealed clear evidence of survival cannibalism at Jamestown. George Percy was a survivor of the starving time, and he returned to Europe in 1612.
A few years later, as a way of demonstrating the colonies were safe for further settlement and that the indigenous people were friendly to Europeans, settler John Rolfe returned to England with his wife, also known as Pocahontas, and their young son, along with around a dozen members of the Powhatan nation. The marriage had been arranged in 1614 and was able to bring a few years of peace between the colonists and the indigenous people. In England, it is believed that the 9th Earl of Northumberland invited the Rolfes to stay in Brentford, close to the Percy family residence Sion House.
George Percy, meanwhile, went on to take part in military campaigns in the Netherlands and in Belgium, most likely the Anglo-Spanish War, which began in 1625, where, according to Percy family tradition, one of his fingers was shot off. His portrait, on display at Sion House, clearly shows the hand with the missing finger. He died in 1632, the same year as his elder brother, the Wizard Earl.
Alnwick Castle and the Smithsonian Institution. For the full version of this story, we recommend reading A Tale of Two Castles by Peter Smith, available in the gift shops at Alnwick Castle and Sion House.
Alnwick Castle has a link to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. The founding of this world-famous set of museums has its origin in a visit to the spa town of Bath by the future First Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, who restored Alnwick Castle in the mid-18th century.
The Duke and Duchess, Hugh and Elizabeth Percy, regularly visited Bath in the early 1760s. Both Percy suffered from gout, and taking the waters there was a popular solution.
Hugh was not a Percy by birth. Elizabeth was the heiress to the dynasty. He'd been known as Sir Hugh Smithson, and took his wife's name around 10 years after their marriage in 1740, which via an Act of Parliament allowed them to inherit Alnwick Castle, as well as other ancestral Percy family lands and properties.
In late 1761, the Percys spent around a month in Bath, and Hugh stayed there 4 days longer than his wife. This was not necessarily unusual, they often lived quite independent lives. But it may have been here where he first met Elizabeth Macy.
Born Elizabeth Hungerford Keat, she had married John Macy in 1753, and they lived at nearby Weston House, as well as having a townhouse in Bath itself. John died in 1761, leaving Elizabeth widowed.
Hugh Percy visited Bath again without his wife for 2 weeks in autumn 1762, again in early 1763, and for another 2 weeks in autumn 1764. The exact birth date of James Smithson, Elizabeth Macy's son, is believed to be around 1765. Sir Hugh Smithson, by this time Percy, has been widely acknowledged as his father, making James illegitimate.
Despite the strong and loving marriage between the first Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, which endured for decades, James was not the first Duke's only illegitimate child. With another widow, Margaret Marriott, he'd fathered Dorothy and Philadelphia, named after his sister and his mother respectively. Both girls took the surname Percy after the Duke's death in 1786, and both were close to James. He also changed his name later in life. We know him as James Smithson today, but until his mother's death in 1800, he was always James Macy.
The Duke never recognised or acknowledged James as his son, and his childhood saw his mother embroiled in various legal battles. By the end of the 1760s, she had married again to John Marsh Dickinson, who was very keen for any money the marriage would bring to fund his extravagant lifestyle. Dickinson pressured Elizabeth to sign her properties over to him. When she resisted, he became violent and she fled. He took possession of many of her belongings, selling them to help pay his debts before trying to force her back to him. She charged him with disturbance of the peace and a series of court battles followed.
Dickinson died in 1771, around a month before Elizabeth gave birth to another son, Henry. She and her husband had not lived together for around 2 years prior to Henry's birth, which leads some historians to suspect he too may have been an illegitimate son of the first Duke.
Neither James nor Henry were ever publicly acknowledged by Hugh, But the fact both collected items and memorabilia connected with the Duke, including a silver medal from 1766 commemorating the restoration of Alnwick Castle, suggests they may have believed he was their father.
While the Duke did make several large deposits into the account of Elizabeth Macy's solicitors, who then paid out sums of money to her, no record of his affairs appear to exist within his own letters, papers, or correspondence.
James had been born in Paris, and after his mother left him in the guardianship of another of her solicitors in London at around the age of 7, he had to apply for British citizenship. The act of naturalisation that followed did not give him full rights of citizenship. He could not be an MP, hold a civil or military post, or be granted land or property from the Crown. It has been suggested that the restrictions of his limited citizenship, along with his illegitimacy, contributed to a lifelong sense of being disenfranchised.
However, James was admitted to Pembroke College, Oxford in 1782, where he developed an expertise in mineralogy. He graduated in 1786, the year of the first Duke of Northumberland's death, and settled in London, where he was soon accepted into the Royal Society, their youngest member at the time. He travelled regularly to Europe, as well as being part of an expedition to explore Scotland's volcanic origins, and established himself in the field of chemistry. He met Antoine Lavoisier, known as the father of modern chemistry, in Paris, and he knew many of the era's best scientists.
By the end of the 1700s, he was one of the original financial backers of the Royal Institution, a new organisation which was devoted to scientific research and education. He made scientific discoveries, helped bring together the disciplines of chemistry and mineralogy, and published 27 papers.
The 1790s saw the deaths of Philadelphia in 1791 and Dorothy 3 years later. Newspaper obituaries publicly acknowledged their connection to the Percys. This was something James had never had. He wasn't mentioned or recognised in the first Duke's will, but in Dorothy's own will she left unto my half-brother James Macy Esquire, natural son to his late Grace Duke of Northumberland, the sum of £3,000. The money was certainly important, but the acknowledgement of his father may have been just as significant to James.
Despite having a well-respected scientific reputation as James Macy, after Elizabeth's death he decided he wished to be known as James Smithson, directly connecting him to his father through Sir Hugh's birth name. Over the following decades he worked hard in developing his finances, turning a small inheritance from his mother into a well-invested fortune.
James Smithson, his brother Henry, and Henry's son, also Henry, settled in Paris, where he was known as a distinguished foreigner of great wealth. The elder Henry died in 1820, entrusting Smithson with instructions to provide for his son. James decided to leave his now considerable fortune to his nephew, and any children the younger Henry might have, legitimate or illegitimate. However, if Henry died without children, the will stipulated that I then bequeath the whole of my property to the United States of America to found at Washington under the name of the Smithsonian Institution, an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men.
Smithson had written his will in 1826, 200 years ago this year, and on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. He died 3 years later in Genoa, Italy, and young Henry quickly claimed his inheritance. By 1835, he too was dead, no older than 27, and without children. The death of Henry set a chain of events in motion that ultimately led to the creation of the Smithsonian.
Exactly why James Smithson chose to leave his fortune to the United States is unknown. He was English. He had no connection to America. He never even visited. It's possible that his early life gave him strong feelings against the class structures of British society that had denied him opportunities. He may have seen America as a place where science could truly flourish. He may have been inspired by the Royal Institution to create a similar organisation in his name somewhere else. The US government was confused when they heard the news of the bequest. President Andrew Jackson was not even sure he had the authority to accept the money, and turned the matter over to Congress to debate whether it could be accepted.
There was scepticism from some representatives. One said it was beneath the dignity of the United States to receive presents of this kind from anyone. Another said that Congress should not pander to the paltry vanity of an individual, and that Washington should not be used as a fulcrum to raise foreigners to immortality. Why would someone with no connection to their nation give so much money? Was it just to have his name on a building in the nation's capital?
It took until summer 1836 for Congress to agree to send someone to England to secure the bequest. They chose lawyer Richard Rush, who had previously spent several years in London as the US ambassador and whose father had been a signatory of the Declaration of Independence. Rush arrived in London in September to find out the case had to be settled by the notoriously slow-moving Court of Chancery.
The first hearing took place in February 1837. A challenge to declare the bequest void and have the money given to the Crown was not successful. Another challenge from young Henry's mother also failed, though she was awarded an annual payment of £150. In the end, the court awarded the money to the USA.
Rush took the money, around £105,000, roughly £6 million today, back to the USA in the form of gold coins, packed in leather bags and sealed in 11 boxes. He arrived in New York in September 1838 and escorted the gold coins to the US Mint in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where they were melted down into US currency, a total of $508,318.46.
More debates followed about what exactly to do with the money. What did Smithson mean by the increase in diffusion of knowledge? The bill to establish the Smithsonian was not passed until August 1846, nearly a decade later, and led to an observatory, a scientific institute, a national library and a museum. In 1855, the Smithsonian Institution was opened.
As for James Smithson himself, he'd been buried in Genoa until in 1903, Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone and a regent of the Smithsonian, argued that James deserved proper recognition and his remains should be brought to Washington to be interred with due honours in the grounds of the institution which he founded. Bell did this, and Smithson's remains arrived in the USA on the 7th of January 1904. They are still in a crypt at the Smithsonian today.
History might have been very different if Sir Hugh Smithson, later Percy, 1st Duke of Northumberland, had acknowledged and recognised James as his son. Would the Smithsonian exist today? We'll never know for sure.
Eustace Percy goes to Washington. Eustace Percy was born in London in 1887, the 12th child and youngest son of Earl and Countess Percy. As a child, he would have celebrated his elder brother Lord Warkworth's coming of age, an occasion that saw Alnwick Castle's great kitchen cater for over 9,000 people across 5 days. Shortly before his 12th birthday, Eustace's parents became the 7th Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, inheriting Alnwick Castle.
Eustace was educated at Christ Church College, Oxford, where he took an interest in issues of social reform. In 1907, he graduated with a first in history, and after university he spent several months in Paris learning French before entering the diplomatic service in 1909. He's said to have done extremely well in the entrance exam.
From 1910 to 1914, Eustace was a diplomat in the United States at the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. The British ambassador in the USA at the time was James Bryce, who'd been in position since 1907 after a long career as an academic, historian and politician. Born in Belfast in 1838, Bryce was an influential intellectual. He'd written a study of American politics in 1888 called The American Commonwealth, which helped develop Victorian Britain's understanding of America.
As ambassador, Bryce had to represent the interests of Britain and its empire. He regularly dealt with questions regarding relations between the United States and Canada. He could count President Theodore Roosevelt among his friends, and his ambassadorship was generally considered very successful.
This all made James Bryce an excellent intellectual mentor for the young Eustace Percy. Eustace used his time in Washington to study American institutions, travel widely, and make influential friends, establishing a reputation as an American expert which endured for many years afterwards. He left his post in America in June of 1914, just 2 months before the outbreak of the First World War in Europe.
During the war, Eustace served in various departments at the Foreign Office in London, but returned twice to Washington on official business. The second occasion was in April 1917, where he was a member of the Balfour Mission, which was prolonged into a 12-month role as a representative of the Ministry of Blockade.
The Balfour Mission was a formal diplomatic visit by the British government to the USA and took place soon after America had entered the war. Its purpose was to promote cooperation, as well as to assess how ready the United States were for war.
Led by Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, who met with President Woodrow Wilson, members of the mission, like Eustace, had their own meetings with leaders in American politics, industry and finance, laying out Britain's position, organising munition supplies and more.
A few days before the mission arrived in Washington, having landed in Nova Scotia, Canada, Eustace wrote to his father. His letter, dated 18th of April, said, "I have a general feeling that the winning or drawing of this war really depends on the Americans, and the only question is whether they can get to work soon enough. Our job, such as it is to appeal to them for absolutely essential assistance without offending Canada. Canada's attitude seems to be, whatever you do keep the Yanks humble. I agree, but it's rather difficult to instill humility into the people you are begging from.
In May 1917, Balfour became the first British person to address both the House of Representatives and the Senate. The mission succeeded and in helping to develop what is often known today as the special relationship between Britain and the USA.
The Ministry of Blockade, meanwhile, had developed from the British government's contraband department within the larger War Department. It was responsible for maintaining land and sea blockades against Germany, something that was vitally important to Britain, but which was less popular in America.
A month after the end of the First World War, on the 4th of December 1918, Eustace had married Stella Catherine, with whom he had 2 daughters.
After the war, Eustace was a Foreign Office representative at the Versailles Peace Conference and helped to draft the Covenant of the League of Nations, the first worldwide intergovernmental organisation with a mission of maintaining world peace.
By the 1920s, Eustace had decided to leave the diplomatic service and go into a more settled life in politics. He was an MP from 1921 until 1937, including a few years as part of the cabinet. His most important post was as president of the Board of Education. A social idealist, he was committed to reducing class sizes, expanding secondary education, and helped to establish the separation of schools into primary and secondary branches. He had hoped to get James Bryce's old job as ambassador in Washington and was considered for the role in 1928, but the government's defeat in the 1929 general election meant Eustace lost the opportunity.
After resigning his seat in 1937, Eustace became the first rector of the Newcastle-based King's College, Durham, a job he held until he retired due to ill health in 1952. After the Second World War, he planned the college's expansion into scientific and technical departments, securing the ability to expand its city centre campus. Eustace Percy died in 1958, but his actions helped King's College to become the independent Newcastle University.
'20th century icons. Martin Luther King. By the late 1960s, Eustace's nephew, Hugh Percy, 10th Duke of Northumberland, was serving as Chancellor of the now established Newcastle University.
It was in this role that the 10th Duke was able to confer an honorary degree on Dr. Martin Luther King on the 13th of November 1967. Newcastle was the only British university to do so during King's lifetime.
The day that King was made an honorary Doctor of Civil Law is still considered one of the most important in the university's history. King, who was only in the UK for 24 hours and had a tight schedule of commitments, was able to visit Newcastle, where the Duke presided over a ceremony in the university's King's Hall.
Dr. King was invited to give an acceptance speech. He began it by saying, "In honouring me today, you not only honour me, but you honour the hundreds and thousands of people with whom I have worked and with whom I have been associated in the struggle for racial justice. And so I say thanks, not only for myself, but I also thank you for them, and I can assure you that this day will remain dear to me as long as the cords of memory shall lengthen." King called for men of goodwill to work passionately and unrelentingly to get rid of racial injustice, whether it exists in the United States of America, whether it exists in England, or whether it exists in South Africa. Wherever it is alive, it must be defeated.
He ended the speech with his hopes for the day when all over the world justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. A full transcript of Dr. King's speech is available to read on the Newcastle University website. Less than 5 months later, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee.
John Steinbeck and the Arthurian Manuscript. Just a few years before the 10th Duke met Martin Luther King, he'd hosted another world-famous American at Alnwick Castle, Nobel Prize-winning author John Steinbeck, who had travelled to the castle in the hope of finding a lost manuscript about King Arthur.
In the 1960s, Steinbeck wrote a series of columns for Newsday called Letters to Alicia. He told the story of his visit to Alnwick in the December 31st, 1965 column, which we'll be quoting from in this podcast.
Steinbeck began, "I write this in haste and excitement, because in the library of Alnwick Castle our quest has been almost magically successful. It will take a long time to study, compare, evaluate and place the find, but I assure you that it is a scholar's pot of gold and a holy grail for Arthurian researchers."
At the time, there was known to be 2 versions of Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Malory. Steinbeck suspected what he found in Alnwick to be a 3rd version. He said, How can I make a comparison in American literary history? Well, suppose you came on a version of Washington's farewell address in a shorter and different form. Imagine finding handwritten notes and suggestions from which came the Declaration of Independence, or finding in Lincoln's handwriting a longer and different version of the Gettysburg Address. There you would have an excitement comparable with this find in Alnwick Castle in Northumberland.
Steinbeck had loved the stories of King Arthur since his 9th birthday, when he received a copy of Morte d'Arthur. He and his sister Mary would play as a knight and squire, and he'd always intended to write his own history of Arthur. The Acts of King Arthur and His Noble Knights, begun by Steinbeck in 1956, would be published 20 years later.
The adult Steinbeck had become friends with a professor at Manchester University, and both had wondered whether other versions of the manuscript might still exist somewhere in Britain. They agreed that their first choice of private libraries would be Alnwick Castle. Steinbeck explained his reasons for wanting to look at the castle library, the first being the age of the castle. He continued, "A second reason for choosing Alnwick is that it has never been destroyed, and third, and most important, that in the Morte d'Arthur, Malory says that Alnwick Castle was once called Joyous Garde and was the seat of Sir Lancelot, where he took Queen Guinevere when he rescued her from the flames."
Through his friend, the actor Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who knew the 10th Duke of Northumberland, Steinbeck and the professor received permission to visit Alnwick and inspect the library. With their wives, the two scholars drove north from Manchester and arrived on a Friday evening. Steinbeck wrote, "A gateman let us in the huge valves of the curtain wall, and we drove through inner gates into the bailey of the keep. It is a fairy place, an ancient house, but in perfect condition, and still lived in by the Duke of Northumberland. We were to have rooms in the Norman keep. There are many things to tell, but I must get to the library, a noble room, books in 2 stories of cases, and half of them available from an encircling gallery. In many ancient houses the libraries have little interest to their owners, but not so at Alnwick. The books were beautifully cared for and immaculately catalogued. The present Duke not only knows what is here, but has added to the collection. The possibility of discovering anything unknown was remote, and we only had 2 nights and 1 day to look."
They spent the weekend searching the books and catalogues of the library, but found nothing. Late on Sunday evening, the professor found a catalogue reference to a historical manuscript that also included legendary British kings, but neither they nor the 10th Duke could locate the manuscript in the case where it should have been.
The following morning there was a knock on Steinbeck's door. It was the professor, who said to him, "Come down, I found something." He'd returned to the library and searched the case again, picking out a volume in what newspapers later described as part chance, part hunch.
Amongst a history of 3 King Edwards and a list of legendary knights, Arthur's name was spotted. Steinbeck wrote, "We whipped through the pages, 48 of them, I think, and came at last to the death of Arthur and his transport to Avalon and the prophecy of his return. There it is, a completely unknown manuscript, our pot of gold. We showed it to the Duke, and he went to the door of my wife's room and called to her, 'They've caught the fox.' What a wonderful thing it is, and how fine to be there when it happened. What instinct drew the professor's hand to the case in the half-darkness, I don't know, but I don't believe in accidents. Now, if we find nothing else in our quest, we have years of work on this, our private holy grail."
Amazingly, the 2 men continued their journey north to Abbotsford, the home of Sir Walter Scott in the Scottish borders, where they examined a 16th century book with an extract which, claimed the newspapers at the time, quoted word for word from the manuscript the professor had found at Alnwick earlier the same day. That suggests that this version of the Arthurian legend must have been popular at that time.
The truth about the discovery is possibly not as exciting as Steinbeck's telling makes it seem, but the fact remains that one of America's best-known novelists once spent a weekend delving into the library here at Alnwick Castle.
The greatest visits Alnwick Castle. A decade after John Steinbeck's adventure, Alnwick Castle was visited by one of America's greatest ever sportsmen, the boxer Muhammad Ali.
In July 1977, Ali, who was the undisputed heavyweight champion at the time and one of the most famous people in the world, made a visit to the northeast of England, spending 4 days on Tyneside.
He'd been invited by a former boxer from the region, Johnny Walker, who travelled to America in search of Ali, persuading him to visit the northeast to promote boys' boxing clubs.
Ali agreed and said of Walker, "I thought if one crazy man could come all the way across the world from Newcastle, he deserved something in return."
Among highlights of the packed schedule for Ali were a reception at the Lord Mayor's Mansion House in Newcastle, a banquet at the Mayfair Ballroom, and the blessing of his recent marriage to wife Veronica. The blessing took place at the Al-Azhar Mosque in South Shields and drew a crowd of around 7,000 well-wishers. Ali was quoted as saying, "Until a few weeks ago, I'd never even heard of Newcastle. Now I love the place. Everyone is so polite and nice and really make me feel like a king. He then added, to think I have so many friends in South Shields. I'm going to tell them in America.
The Northumberland Gazette at the time reported that, during the North East visit, Arley's wife expressed the wish to see a good castle, and Alnwick was the choice. Word soon spread around the castle, and crowds of lucky visitors were assembled to give the champ a rapturous welcome. The Arley party arrived in style in a string of Mercedes together with a posse of pressmen. They stayed for about an hour and had a good look around the castle, and Alnwick autographed a number of guidebooks. It was quite an occasion for everyone.
While the visit to the castle was at the invitation of the 10th Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, Ali was not able to meet them here as they were away from Alnwick at the time. However, 2 years later, he sent them a signed photograph. The full signature read, "To the Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, best wishes from Muhammad Ali, 3 times heavyweight boxing champion of the world. Service to others is the price we pay for our room here on earth. 19/11/1979, time 1:55 a.m., Los Angeles, California." The photograph was most recently displayed in the staterooms at Alnwick Castle following the death of Muhammad Ali in 2016.
We hope you enjoyed hearing this selection of stories, showing that before and after Earl Percy and the Revolution, Alnwick Castle has had some fascinating ties to America.
If you enjoyed hearing this selection of shorter stories, you may also like episode 45 of the podcast, which looks at some of the strange and mysterious tales connected to Alnwick Castle. Head into our back catalogue to find that one. And if you'd like to hear similar episodes in the future, get in touch and let us know on podcast@alnwickcastle.com.
On next month's episode, we'll be speaking to Algernon Percy, author of A Bearskin's Crimea, the story of Victoria Cross medal winner Henry Hugh Manvers Percy. We hope you'll join us for that, but until then, I've been Deborah.
And I've been Daniel.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.